Well, the Board Member Academy. This is week 4, looking at intentional practices. You know, if governance is leadership, the big question is, how does the board actually lead? Well, primarily through policy development and implementation to ensure that you're providing a course of action for which you can hold someone accountable. Usually your CEO, but also sometimes the board and the chair. So within that role of leadership, 4 roles clearly evolve, and you know what they are. You set strategic direction on behalf of your community. You develop that constructive and critical partnership with your CEO or executive director. You ensure sustainable and sustaining resources so you can achieve your mission. And you monitor, assess, evaluate, audit programs and services and finances. So for today, we're going to look at policy and planning, but we've broken it into 2 shorter presentations because they are each so important. And we're going to start with policy. Policy review, policy development, policy implementation. So policies are principles, rules, guidelines you have formulated or adopted to reach your long-term goals, and they're readily accessible. Now, first, let's make a few distinctions among bylaws, policies, and procedures. So briefly stated, and we'll come back to these, briefly stated, bylaws lay out your fundamental governing rules and regulations. It's a legal document. It outlines the activity that your society or agency can pursue. Policy, on the other hand, lays out the what and why. These are statements of direction adopted by the board to regulate, direct, and control the actions and conduct of your organization. Now, procedures lay out the how. So policy is the what and the why, procedures are the how. How to and who will implement the policy. These are details that take policy to action. They outline how day-to-day operations are to be conducted. So a procedure is a series of steps to be followed as a consistent and repetitive approach to accomplish an end result. Now, back to bylaws. Bylaws include specific components. Generally, they include your official name, the location of your office, your statement of purpose, any limitations you have for tax purposes, for example, around lobbying, the procedures for amending the bylaws, the procedures for dissolving your agency or society, and disposition of any assets on dissolution. Now, if you're a membership organization, your bylaws might also include qualification for membership, dues obligations, perhaps different classes of member, any notice required for meetings, for quorum, frequency of meetings, procedures for meetings, and circumstances where a member might be expelled, as well as your voting procedures. Bylaws also provide rules for the board of directors or trustees. For example, the size of your board, again, qualifications for membership, terms of office, any term limits, the selection process, the process for filling vacancies, the frequency of board meetings, the quorum, voting requirements, meeting procedures, also the powers of the executive committee if there is one, any compensation and circumstances where a board member may be removed, and of course, conflict of interest procedures. Now for your officers, again, qualifications for any officers, their duties, the process for selecting and appointing officers, their term, any term limits, and circumstances under which an officer may be removed. Fiscally, the bylaws may describe the audit committee and audits, the fiscal year, And of course, indemnification insurance for officers and directors. Now, in spite of what I just said, bylaws should not be overly detailed or prescriptive. You need to be nimble. Because if you're a membership organization, you have to go back to the membership to change your bylaws. So you want to keep to what is legally required, the fundamentals. And approval of changes to the bylaws requires a 2/3 vote, quite different for a policy, which is a board policy. So now for policies. The boards of voluntary, not-for-profit organizations normally governed by establishing policies. Again, a policy is a guiding principle used to set direction and a course of action. We want to provide a positive benefit, or at least mitigate a negative effect. For example, we have purchasing policies. Now, typically, a policy will articulate and define important objectives, principles, or values. The policy will limit or prescribe what kind of action will be taken in different situations. And it usually defines roles and responsibilities and authority for the policy. Well, how are policies created? It tends to be a proactive process, a teamwork with staff and board members, typically in policy formulation. However, the final approval of any policy is the task of the board. But the board does not get involved in detailed staff processes and procedures, the what and the why versus the how. So drafting and assessing new policies takes time and research. And it's necessary to know the legal requirements and implications of any policy, as well as being tuned into any new trends. Obviously, we recommended that you have a policy and planning committee, or at least some group charged with policy review on a regular basis, development, and overseeing implementation. You want to avoid instant policymaking on the fly. You want to avoid dictatorial policymaking. Sometimes it's illegal, it's sloppy, it's contradictory. You can create more problems than you solve. So before a problem can be created, a problem must exist that's called to your attention. And formulation of policy is then undertaken by a committee with the staff and then adopted by the board, implemented by the CEO typically with a reporting procedure. And then there's a regular evaluation and review, revision, or termination. And this is often stated in the policy, how long it lasts, when it will be reviewed, and so on. Well, what are some examples of sample policies? Well, first, there's always a policy on policy development. And then there typically are maybe 8 clusters that I'm going to provide here as examples. Now, don't get overwhelmed as I run through these. You probably already have them, but it's worth checking. The first cluster is ethics and accountability. Your mission, your vision, your values, your code of ethics, conflict of interest, confidentiality, whistleblower protection, record retention and document destruction. Cluster around board and board members, the role of the board, any board member agreements, code of conduct, criteria for new board members, the board chair's job description, other board officer job descriptions, any compensation for board members, for example, for expenses, reimbursements, the board self-assessment, decision-making and meeting practices and accountability if it's not in the bylaws. Then a cluster around your chief officer or executive director, the chief officer job description, role, responsibility, authority, performance evaluation, policy around executive compensation, and sometimes around executive transition or succession management. A cluster around finance and investments, around your budget, capital expenditures, financial controls, investments, your reserves and endowments, financial audits, risk management. You might want to go back and see which of these you have, which are missing, note them in your workbook, and then decide whether they need to be addressed. Fundraising. Any responsibilities for board member fundraising, donor relations, gift acceptance by staff in particular, sponsorships and endorsements. Are there some organizations from which you will not accept sponsorship? Any ethical considerations? Personnel. Who's responsible for human resources? How are you an equal employment employer? What is your policy on nepotism, sexual harassment, the workplace environment, how complaints are handled, performance reviews, the treatment and protection of your customer, client, consumer, user information? Then around communication, what is your policy around media relations, crisis communication, the use of electronic media, advocacy, public education perhaps, and lobbying and political activity? And then lastly, around committees, policies around governance, finance, development, executive, other committees, advisory councils perhaps, roles and responsibilities, job description for committee chairs. Now, I would suggest that when you develop policy, it's according to a standard format, a template. You might start with your organization's name, a policy number or cluster area, the name of the policy, statement of purpose, its applicability and scope, any definitions, perhaps an example, then assignment of responsibility and perhaps oversight, and then a schedule for monitoring and review, and it should automatically go on the agenda on that date for reporting. The date it was approved, the date it takes effect, and the date it was last modified. The reason I suggest a standard format or template is that it's far easier to review and see that components are integrated and there rather than missing. And of course, all of these go into a policy and procedures manual. Now, there's a lot here, but if you take a systematic approach, you can deal with these in a very even-handed way. And of course, it's critically important to your role in governance as leadership because policy provides direction for your organization. So next up, the planning part of policy and planning and strategic planning. And there are resources available for you, of course, and opportunities to reflect and add notes in the workbook. Please contact me if you've got any questions or concerns. Thank you.